This part will be oriented around the autonomous nervous system and its relation to the dark period, and will explain in detail why certain activities should be avoided during the dark period. So, the autonomic nervous system is split into two parts, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. These nervous systems correlate to the circadian rhythm so that the sympathetic nervous system is dominant during the day and the parasympathetic nervous system, PNS, is dominant during the night. In terms of function, the SNS is responsible for your fight or flight system, and the PNS is responsible for the secretion of sleep-related hormones, recovering the body and the mind, de-stressing, and much more. SNS activation leads to an increased blood pressure and heart rate. It also stimulates the medulla glandula supralis and sorry, I'm not a biology major, as you can probably tell, but the different words will be visible on screen if you want to learn their actual names. But anyways, SNS also secretes adrenaline and non-adrenaline. When the SNS is activated, digestion activity is inhibited, while on the other hand, PNS activation leads to an increased peristalsis and secretion of digestive hormones, as well as a decreased heart rate and blood pressure. After a quick glance, it is clear that these two parts of the autonomic nervous system are responsible for completely different functions of the body. The optimal circadian health is achieved by allowing the SNS to be dominant during the day and not during the night, as constantly keeping the SNS engaged will lead to elevated blood pressures, which increases the chance of developing various diseases. Engaging the SNS during the night will also lead to you having more stress and leads to things like hypertension, ischemic heart disease, chronic heart failure, kidney disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, obstructive sleep apnea, depression, and various other diseases. So in other words, overengaging the SNS leads to the potential development of stress-related disorders. Since activating the SNS around the clock is a bad idea, you need to know how to avoid doing it. So how would you actually activate the SNS? Well, there are several ways to do it. Activities like eating and exercising lead to the activation of the SNS, which means that they should be avoided during both the dark period and close to your habitual sleep times. This is because only either of your nervous systems is able to be fully engaged at once. So if you engage the SNS, your PNS will be disengaged because of it. Let's use an example to help ground this point. So activating the PNS could be compared to doing a relaxing task like stretching or meditating. Activating the SNS, on the other hand, could be compared to doing a physical strenuous task like running or exercising intensely. It's only possible to do either one of these at once, which means that activating one of the systems leads to the activity of the other one decreasing significantly. In this example, you can't, for example, stretch while running, and the situation is very similar to the actual bodily functions. As opposed to activating the SNS, activating the PNS around the clock isn't correlated to any negative effects. On the contrary, since activating the PNS leads to a reduction in blood pressure, it's very healthy to do in the middle of the day. This is easily achieved by taking a short nap, for example, during the day. Apart from the long-term consequences of keeping the SNS active around the clock, there's also the immediate effects from over-engaging your SNS. If you're trying to sleep after engaging the SNS, it will lead to issues with falling asleep, issues staying asleep, and your sleep quality will also suffer. In other words, when you engage your SNS, it will take longer to fall asleep due to the increased heart rate and adrenaline secretion. You will also have a harder time staying asleep and may experience mid-sleep wakes. And when you finally wake up, you will not feel rested since you have missed out on a lot of valuable vital sleep. Because of this, you are recommended to do the certain recommendations or follow the certain recommendations regarding the activities that engage your SNS. So, eating large meals has been shown to have an effect for up to 2 hours after the meal intake on elevated muscle sympathetic nerve activity and blood pressure. Both of these will negatively affect your sleep quality and the duration of vital sleep stages that you get, and it's therefore recommended to avoid meals around 2 to 3 hours before a scheduled sleep. Because of the muscle sympathetic nerve activity, and the increased blood pressure, this leads to the suppression of the PNS, and you should therefore avoid doing this activity during the dark period, or in other words, you shouldn't eat during the dark period. Small meals of around 150 kilocalories and below should not have any effect on your sleep, and you should therefore be safe to consume that amount before a nap without any negative effects. Okay, so when you exercise, your sympathetic activity will also increase, and because of that, it's suggested that you are sufficiently calmed down during your dark period and before a habitual sleep time. If you want to exercise before a scheduled sleep time, you need to consider the intensity of the exercise, where more intensity leads to a longer necessary winding down time of up to 2 hours. Because of the increased sympathetic activity, it's also recommended that you avoid exercising during the dark period completely. Or well, not completely, you can like go on walks, but don't train vigorously, you know, don't go to the gym, don't do HIIT, keep it to calm activities, okay? Anyways, the last tip is for drinking water. You may not have expected this. Water should be consumed throughout the night so that you stay hydrated, but you should avoid drinking lots of fluids at once. The healthiest option is therefore to drink around a glass of water every hour during the night. So let's recap here. You should not eat or exercise before your habitual sleep times and during the dark period. You should also stay hydrated during the night. Okay, so now you have these general tips. Please share in the comment section below if there's anything you would like me to expand on this topic. It was a pretty short video, so maybe you feel like there's something that you want to know more of. Well, don't keep us impatient, hit me up with the questions. I'll gladly try to answer them to the best of my ability. Okay, anyways, have a good one and remember to have pleasant naps, people.